What could drive a respected Texas pastor, a man admired by his community and devoted to his faith, to commit an unthinkable act? What hidden truth could push a man to dismember his own wife? It all began with a DNA test, an unexpected revelation that tore a family apart. A discovery so shocking, it unraveled everything he thought he knew about his children, his marriage, and himself. What followed was a descent into betrayal, rage, and horror. What really happened? Stay with us. In the quiet Texas town of Cedar Valley, life moved at a comforting rhythm. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved from their porches, church bells rang every Sunday morning, and trust was the currency of the community. At the heart of it all was Pastor David Harris, a man whose voice could command a room, whose sermons brought tears to the eyes of his congregation. To many, he wasn't just a preacher. He was a counselor, a mentor, a rock for those in need. His life appeared perfect. A devoted wife named Sarah, 2 bright and beautiful children, and a reputation that stretched far beyond the pews of his church. But as we often learn, appearances can deceive. Behind the warm smiles and heartfelt sermons, there was another story waiting to be told. And it began with a decision that seemed innocent enough: taking a DNA test. It wasn't curiosity or a simple gift that led David to order the test. He had been dealing with unexplained health issues, fatigue, dizziness, nothing too alarming, but enough for his wife to insist on finding answers. At her urging, he decided to explore his genetic history, hoping the test might provide some clarity. But the results revealed something far more profound than medical insights. They exposed a truth no one saw coming, a truth that would destroy the life he had built, piece by piece. That single test opened a door to the past that David Harris had never intended to walk through. It revealed that his 2 beloved children, the ones he had raised, loved, and prayed for, were not biologically his. And worse, the DNA pointed to someone he trusted implicitly, someone whose betrayal cut deeper than any wound imaginable: his own stepfather. The man who stood as a symbol of faith and resilience suddenly found himself consumed by emotions he had spent his life preaching against: anger, humiliation, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. How could the very foundation of his family be built on such a devastating lie? How could he face the people who had trusted him, who had looked to him as a moral compass, when his own life had unraveled so completely? This isn't just the story of a crime. It's the story of a man forced to confront the darkest corners of his soul, of secrets hidden in plain sight, and of choices that would devastate not just his family, but an entire community. As we unravel the events that led to that fateful day, one question looms above all: what drives a man of God to commit an act so horrifying that it shocks even those closest to him? From the outside, the Harris family seemed like a portrait of happiness. Sunday mornings were spent at church, where Pastor David Harris delivered sermons that inspired faith and hope. His wife Sarah was the picture of grace, always by his side, a partner in life and ministry. Their 2 children, bright and full of energy, were the center of their world. And then there was James, David's stepfather, a man who had played a significant role in David's life since his teenage years. He was trusted, respected, and deeply entwined in their family's story. But the ties that bound them were about to be tested in ways no one could imagine. It all began with that fateful DNA test. What was meant to answer a few lingering health questions had instead opened a door that could never be closed. When David learned that his stepfather was the biological father of his children, it wasn't just a betrayal. It was an unraveling of everything he believed in: his marriage, his family, his very identity. The man he had trusted, looked up to, and called family had been keeping a secret so devastating it shattered the foundation of David's world. As the days turned into weeks, David tried to carry on. To those around him, he seemed composed, but beneath the surface, the cracks were beginning to show. There were long, sleepless nights where he stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment of his life. The laughter of his children became a painful reminder of the truth he could no longer escape. The betrayal wasn't just about blood. It was about the years of lies, the quiet deceit that had woven its way into his home without him ever realizing it. In the weeks leading up to the crime, small but troubling signs began to emerge. David and Sarah's once happy home became a place of tension and unease. Neighbors noticed arguments behind closed doors, muffled shouts in the dead of night. Friends whispered about the sudden strain in their marriage, though no one dared to pry. And then there were the phone calls, late at night, brief and hushed, leaving David visibly agitated. Was it James on the other end of the line, or was it something else entirely? One evening, David was seen leaving his church earlier than usual, his face clouded with an expression no one could quite place. He drove home in silence, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Sarah greeted him at the door, her smile faltering as she saw the look in his eyes. That night, neighbors would later recall hearing muffled sounds, an argument, the crash of something heavy falling to the floor. And then, silence. The next morning, David didn't show up for his usual coffee meeting with a close friend. He didn't respond to calls or messages. Sarah, too, was nowhere to be found. For days, the house remained dark, the curtains drawn, as if trying to hide the secrets held within. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. And soon, the world would learn just how wrong it was. One night, something in David snapped. After weeks of torment, anger, and betrayal, the man who had spent his life preaching forgiveness and redemption found himself standing at a crossroads. What happened next would send shockwaves through the community, leaving no one untouched. But the truth, as shocking as it was, didn't emerge all at once. In the days that followed, the police would uncover pieces of a puzzle that painted a picture more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. And at the center of it all was a man grappling with the weight of betrayal, a betrayal so deep it pushed him to the edge. What drove David Harris to cross that line? And could anything have stopped him before it was too late? The first few days after the disappearance were filled with confusion. The town of Crestwood was a quiet one. People kept to themselves, and the Harris family had always been seen as pillars of the community. Pastor David Harris, with his kind smile and caring nature, had always been a man of integrity. His wife, Sarah, was known for her gentle spirit. She was the woman behind the man, always in the background, but supportive of every decision. In many ways, she was his anchor, and in their community, she was respected and loved just as much as he was. Sarah had never suspected anything, at least not in the way that would later be revealed. She had seen the strain in David's eyes, the long nights when he couldn't sleep. But she attributed it to the pressure of his role in the church, the weight of expectations, and the emotional toll of leading others. Little did she know, the man she had married, the man who stood beside her every Sunday in front of their congregation, was fighting a battle of his own, a battle so profound that it would ultimately consume everything they had built together. When Sarah went missing, the entire town was stunned. At first, investigators assumed it was another tragic case of domestic violence, a quarrel gone horribly wrong. The evidence at first glance pointed in that direction, but something didn't feel right. Something was off. The more they looked, the more the story didn't add up. For the first time in their careers, the investigators found themselves questioning their initial assumptions. Detective Rachel Monroe, the lead investigator on the case, had been in law enforcement for nearly 20 years. She'd seen her fair share of shocking crimes, but nothing prepared her for what she would uncover in the Harris household. As she combed through the scene, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than a simple domestic dispute. Something felt methodical, as though the violence was calculated, precise, almost deliberate. At first, the evidence was sparse, nothing that screamed murder, at least not in the way they expected. No signs of forced entry, no obvious struggle. The The crime scene, while horrific, lacked the chaos typical of violent attacks. And that's when the detectives started to ask the tough questions. How could a man like David Harris, so beloved, so trusted, turn on his wife in such a brutal way? What had been building beneath the surface for so long? The more they uncovered, the more the case twisted into something far darker than anyone could have imagined. Sarah's body was found in the family home, but the details of her death were chilling. There was no doubt that the crime had been committed with rage, but the way the act had been carried out suggested something far more calculated. It wasn't the kind of violence that happens in the heat of the moment. It was something more premeditated, more deliberate. Detectives had to piece together the details slowly, carefully. There were no signs of panic, no indication that David was trying to cover his tracks in any traditional sense. In fact, it almost seemed as though he'd wanted it to be found in a way. The crime scene was almost too clean, too deliberate. The brutality of the act shocked even the most seasoned detectives, leaving them grappling with the harsh reality that the crime didn't simply mark the end of a marriage, it marked the destruction of an entire family, an entire life. The community was stunned. Pastor David's followers were in disbelief. How could the man they'd trusted with their spiritual lives be capable of something so horrific? How could someone who had spent his life preaching love and forgiveness, someone who had guided countless families, be the one to destroy his own? It shook them to the core. There was no comfort in the truth, no solace in understanding what had happened. The town, once a place of peace and stability, was left reeling. The house, once filled with laughter, was eerily quiet now. The only sound was the soft hum of the ceiling fan, a cruel reminder of what had been lost. Investigators moved through the wreckage of what had once been a home now consumed by death and disbelief. There were no words that could make sense of it, no way to explain why someone so devoted to God, to family, could fall so far. The sight of the house, abandoned and broken, left an indelible mark on everyone who walked through its doors. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of the tragedy. As the investigation unfolded, one thing became clear: there was no easy answer, no simple explanation that could wrap up the case in a neat little bow. David's actions, his betrayal, were part of something much larger, something no one could fully comprehend yet. The pieces were still falling into place, and with each new discovery, the truth began to take shape. But even then, it was clear that the final revelation would be far worse than anyone could have imagined. For days, the investigation had seemed to inch closer to some sort of resolution. Detective Rachel Monroe, along with her team, had pieced together what they believed to be the most likely scenario: a troubled marriage, a man under intense pressure, and a tragic outcome. But just when it seemed the case had been solved, the ground beneath them shifted. The clues they had once thought were definitive now seemed to suggest something entirely different. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. It wasn't a new witness, a forgotten piece of evidence, or even a sudden confession. It came from a document hidden away, nearly forgotten. A paternity test tucked into a drawer. A test that had never been intended to see the light of day, but which would soon turn the case upside down. This single document, seemingly insignificant, would soon reveal the ugly truth that had been concealed for years. Pastor David Harris had always believed that the children he had raised, the children he had poured his heart and soul into, were his by blood. They were his family, or so he thought. The paternity test, discovered almost by accident, revealed a different story, a story no one could have anticipated. The children, his own flesh and blood, were not his. They were his stepfather's. His stepfather, a man he had admired, respected, and trusted, had fathered the very children David had loved as his own. For David, this discovery was devastating. It wasn't just about betrayal, It was about identity. Everything he had believed in, everything he had built his life around, had been shattered in an instant. He had lived his entire life with a secret, a truth hidden from him, and now it was inescapable. How could he have not known? How could the man he'd seen as a father, a mentor, betray him so thoroughly? Was David aware of the affair? Did he know that the man who had helped shape his life, who had stood by his side through thick and thin, had crossed a line so deep, so intimate, that it defied belief? Or did the truth come as a complete shock to him? The answer remained unclear, but what was certain was that the discovery sent shockwaves through the pastor's mind, unraveling him from the inside out. The emotional toll of this revelation was far greater than anyone could have anticipated. And then, just when it seemed like the worst had already come to light, the story took another turn. David Harris, the once beloved pastor, made an unexpected confession, one that stunned the investigators and left everyone questioning his motives. He confessed to the murder, but there was something more to it. He wasn't just confessing to end the charade. He was confessing to something deeper, something that involved a long-standing grudge. His confession didn't just come from guilt. It came from a deep-seated need for revenge, for retribution, for something he felt had been taken from him for far too long. David's confession wasn't the simple, emotional outpouring that one might expect. It was calculated, measured, as if he had been carrying this burden for so long that the release of it felt almost like a form of redemption. He spoke of his stepfather's betrayal with a coldness that was unsettling. He spoke of the years of feeling inferior, of knowing something was off but not knowing what it was. And when the truth finally came to light, it didn't bring closure, it brought only more questions. At first, investigators struggled to understand the depths of David's feelings. Was this truly a crime of passion, the result of a long-hidden secret? Or was it something more calculated? Had David, over the years, been carefully constructing the circumstances that would eventually lead him to this breaking point? The more they delved into his past, the more they realized that this wasn't just about a murder. It was about identity, legacy, and a profound sense of betrayal. The paternity test, the confession, and the subsequent events all painted a picture of a man at war with himself, torn between his faith, his sense of self, and the father figure who had destroyed him. But there was still more to uncover. Even as David confessed to the murder, there was a feeling that the full truth had not been revealed. A nagging doubt lingered in the air. Was there something else? Something even more damning? The investigators couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of the story, that there was more hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. Each twist, each new revelation, left everyone involved wondering just how far the web of lies had spread. With every step, the case became more complex, more layered. The discovery of the paternity test had shattered David's world, but it was the confession and the emotions behind it that would haunt everyone involved for years to come. What drove a man to the point of no return? What could have pushed someone so devout, so respected, to commit such a horrific act? The answers were still out of reach, but one thing was certain. This was no ordinary crime, and as the investigation progressed, it became clear that the truth was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. As the investigation concluded and the details of Pastor David Harris's dark secret were laid bare for the world to see, the community was left in shock. The man who had stood before them every Sunday, preaching faith, hope, and love, was now revealed to be the very person responsible for a horrific crime. His arrest came swiftly after his confession. In those moments, when the handcuffs clicked shut, it wasn't just a man who had been detained. It was an entire community's sense of security that had been shattered. The arrest was the first of many blows. Pastor Harris, once seen as a pillar of faith, now faced an uncertain future. His community, The very people he had once led were forced to come to terms with an unimaginable truth. Was this the same man they had trusted? Was he the same figure they had put their faith in for so long? Those questions hung in the air, unanswered, as the investigation turned into a spectacle that would captivate the nation. The trial that followed was a public spectacle in every sense of the word. The man who had once stood as a beacon of moral integrity now found himself in the defendant's chair, with every aspect of his life, his past, and his faith put under a microscope. The defense tried to paint a picture of a man undone by years of emotional turmoil, someone whose actions, though tragic, stemmed from an overwhelming sense of betrayal. But the prosecution, in turn, saw only a cold, calculated crime, one that could never be fully explained, no matter the circumstances. Could a man of God, a man of faith, truly be forgiven for such an act? Was there ever a point in time where redemption was still possible? Or had his betrayal run too deep for reconciliation? The emotional toll was immense. His children, the very ones he had raised and believed to be his own, were now caught in a storm of their own making. The question of who they were, of what their true identity meant, hung over them like a heavy cloud. How could they go on knowing the truth about their father's deception? What did that mean for them, both as individuals and as a family? For them, the past would never be the same again. The shattered pieces of their lives could never be fully put back together. And then there was the community, the congregation that had once looked to Pastor Harris for spiritual guidance. They too were left with a gaping hole where their trust used to be. They had been lied to, deceived by a man who had preached truth and love, yet whose life had been built on a foundation of lies. For them, the question was no longer about faith. It was about what to do with the broken pieces of a relationship that could never be healed. Could they continue to hold on to their faith? Or had this revelation stripped it all away, leaving them to wonder what had ever been real in the first place? The emotional aftermath of this tragedy rippled far beyond just the Harris family. It affected the entire community, pulling at the very fabric of trust that had once held them together. The once celebrated pastor, who had spent years serving others, now found himself vilified in the eyes of those who once loved him. What did it mean for the future of faith in a place like this? Could the trust ever be restored? Could the people ever look at their church the same way again, knowing that their faith had been so deeply shaken by a man they had trusted with their hearts? And yet there is still one lingering question that remains unanswered. Did the truth justify the violence that was inflicted on those who were closest to him? Could the deep emotional pain that Pastor Harris felt from his betrayal ever excuse the crime he committed? Was this simply the breaking point of a man who had lived a lifetime in the shadow of lies and deceit? Or was there something deeper, something more monstrous at play? Something that went beyond pain and into a realm of darkness none of us can fully comprehend? Could the family ever heal from such a betrayal? Could the community forgive him, or was the damage irreparable? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when trust is shattered to the point that no one knows what to believe anymore? Was this a tragedy of human weakness, or something else entirely? A crime driven by an inner darkness so profound that it could never be fully understood. As the story unfolds before us, we're left with more questions than answers. The complexity of Pastor Harris's actions, the emotional turmoil, and the events that led to the unimaginable crime. Everything begs us to consider what we really know about the truth. Was the discovery of his family's secrets enough to break him? Could the unraveling of his past have driven him to such a desperate act? Or was there something more behind the surface? Something that we may never truly understand? What do you think really happened? We want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe the truth about the family pushed the pastor to the edge? Could the pain of betrayal have clouded his judgment? Or was there something else hidden beneath it all, something that went unnoticed by everyone? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters, and it might just shed new light on this haunting case. If you found this story compelling, if it left you questioning everything you thought you knew about trust, betrayal, and the consequences of hidden truths, then you won't want to miss what's coming next. This is just the beginning of a journey into the most shocking and thought-provoking cases, and we're diving even deeper. Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you won't miss out on the next episode.